You're listening to localwebradio.fm. Community-minded, locally focused.
Welcome to the Healthy Smiles Oral Health Show with Dr. Norm Ickert, brought to you by Eckert Dental Implant Centre, where they are committed to providing you with the very best in modern and advanced dentistry. Now, here's your host.
Hello, this is Nick Jaworski, and I am your host today, and I am here with Dr. Norm Ickert, director of the Eckert Dental Implant Centre, and today we'll be talking about some of the techniques involved with hard tissue or bone grafting. Now, before Dr. Ickert joins us, just a reminder that if you have questions or require assistance, you can call Dr. Ickert's office at 604-881-1381. That's 604-881-1381. Dr. Ickert, it is great to be talking with you today.
Thank you, Nick. I always look forward to these sessions together with you.
All right. Now, in the last couple podcasts, we've talked about hard tissue and soft tissue, which is bone and gum grafting, and when it may be required. In today's session, we're going to explore some of the techniques involved with hard tissue and bone grafting. How does bone grafting actually work?
Well, Nick, without trying to get too technical, there are three distinct biological processes by which new bone can be formed. And what's paramount to each one of these different processes is two things. A, you need adequate blood supply, and B, you need some presence of existing bony walls, which provides the source of new bone cells. So you just can't graft bone in air. You have to have a solid wall against which you can graft the bone. Now, the best way I found to understand how bone grafting works is to actually just take a moment to try and figure out how new bone is formed in an extraction socket. In other words, when we remove a tooth, how does that site, which is a big hole, all of a sudden in 105 days later fill up with bone and gum tissue, and it feels like nothing was ever really done? In other words, how does nature regenerate new bone? That's really a key question. And there are three specific processes that we can use with the grafting that we do. And one is called osteogenesis, which simply means taking live bone cells from one part of the body and transferring them to another part of the body and hoping that they will survive and grow new bone. So, for example, you could take some bone from the hip, which has amazing potential for new bone growth, and you can take those cells, usually cancellous cells, and you can place them in the jaw if you want to rebuild the jaw. Or you can take them from the knee. The kneecap has a great source of new bone as well. So there are these sources that you can take, and these cells usually survive about 4 days before they, if they're not nourished with oxygen and blood, it's going to be over. But if you do it in a proper manner, that can happen. And this is usually done under the care of an oral surgeon in a hospital setting.
Oh, that's an incredible thought to me. And I'm glad. I was just going to ask who was responsible for that procedure, and you just mentioned it would be in a hospital with somebody who specialized in that.
Yeah, in most cases. I mean, in some offices they can be done under general anesthetic in office settings, but for the most part, this is done in a hospital type of environment. All right. And these are mostly reserved for the really major bone grafts when there really is no other bone and you're trying to use the best possible technique to give you the best possible chance. But in the average, everyday dental office where dental implants are done, this technique is not used very much. There is another technique called osteoinduction, and that's a really cool concept where you can actually turn on cells in the body that are just floating around, and they can be differentiated into different types of cells. They can be bone cells, they can be gum cells, they can be all different types of cells, but they're kind of floating around in an undifferentiated, uncommitted fashion. And when you subject them to a certain protein, it's like putting a key in and unlocking the system, and all of a sudden these cells begin to produce new bone. That's what we call bone morphogenic proteins, BMP. We have those in our system, and that's what we really have when, let's say, we take a tooth out and there is damage to the bone and it has to heal. These cells come into the site and they turn on the surrounding cells to become new bone-forming cells. And this is a very, very cool system.
That's incredible. I mean, that's even more incredible than the first one.
And so this is becoming more common as well in the dental office, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But the third and the most common way that we grow bone in the everyday practice is by a process called osteoconduction. And what it really means is that we're just creating a scaffold in the site where there is no bone. We're putting something into that space which attracts the blood cells, which then brings new bone cells into the site, and these little bone cells can then basically just jump from these little particles that we have placed into the socket or into the area where the hole is, and these cells then begin to jump from one of these little particles to the other and start laying down bone. It's a little bit like growing a crystal, so to speak. And this is what we use most often when we try to build bone in our general settings in the office.
I mean, those are all incredible. Science is incredible. And since osteoconduction is the one that you usually use, would you care to sort of elaborate on that process and how that plays out?
Gladly. The concept is that you've got a space, and if you just left that space and did nothing, what would happen is that soft tissue would grow very quickly into that space and just fill it. In other words, the site would be repaired with soft tissue because the bone never likes to be naked, but it wouldn't be regenerated. So you'd have a defect there. You see, soft tissue grows at approximately 1 millimeter a day, whereas bone grows at 1 millimeter a month. So if you have a space and it needs to be filled, guess who's going to win? The
Right.
gum's always going to win. So what we need to do if we're using this technique is to keep the gum away. So we have to create a space so the gum doesn't grow into that space and allow that space to fill in with bone. So what we do is we take bone particles either from a cow or from another human being or from a synthetic source, and we fill the space, and then we put a barrier over top of that space, like maybe a membrane, collagen membrane, to protect the soft tissue from growing into that site. So we're creating a self-contained space that only allows blood to get into that space and give it enough time to turn into bone, and that can take anywhere from 4 to 6 months. So that's really what we call guided bone regeneration is. It is a method of guiding the bone by creating a scaffold, which is then protected by a membrane to prevent it from having soft tissue grow into it. And this guides the bone, and if we leave this area undisturbed and it's well nourished with good blood supply, in 3 to 4 months, depending on what kind of material you use, this will turn into new bone. And what's really interesting is that the bone that we place, or the bone particles that we place into the site to create the scaffold, let's say it's cow bone or it's even human bone from a different person, that bone all goes away. The whole purpose is to allow your own body to regenerate its own bone in that area. So the particles that we put in there get turned over and replaced by your own bone. So it eventually all becomes your own bone.
Wow, that's, again, I hate to keep repeating this, but this is incredible to me. And you just mentioned cow bone or another human bone. So what I think I did not expect that. What kind of materials are you using in this bone grafting procedure?
For this process called guided bone regeneration, which we just discussed, where we fill the space with some material and then we cover it with a membrane, we have 4 specific options. We can use what we call autogenous bone, which is bone from the patient itself. We can scrape this bone with various techniques. We can harvest it in several different ways. There's all kinds of techniques to gain bone in a very non-invasive manner, and we can use your own bone to fill this space. Or If it's difficult to get your own bone, then we will use what we call an allograft, which is also human bone, except it's from another human being. And this is, of course, extremely safe the way it's treated. There's no chance of cross-contamination. And this bone also just acts like a scaffold. And then the third option is what we call bovine bone or even equine bone. So either from a cow or from a horse, you can use this bone and it will fill the gap and allow your own blood to fill the space and eventually create its own bone as it uses this cow bone as a scaffold to let the little cells jump on each other and eventually grow your own bone.
Wow.
And finally, if somebody has an issue with using cow bone or bovine bone, then we even have what we call synthetic bone, which is an alloplast, which is synthetically made. And it usually like little marbles, tiny little marbles that we can place into the site. And this takes a little bit longer to resorb or turn over, but it is an option for some people. And each one of these techniques have different pros and cons in terms of, for example, how quickly the bone turns over into your own bone depends on the kind of material. If you use your own bone or human bone from a different patient, that bone will turn over into its own bone very quickly. Whereas if you use the little glass marble, so to speak, the alloplast, that might take 9 months or 12 months to turn over into your own bone. Or maybe it doesn't turn over at all, but it still creates a solid base for you to place an implant into. So there's different reasons why we use different types of bone.
Again, incredible, and we have to take a quick break. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Dr. Norm Ickert from the Eckert Dental Implant Centre. And when we return, we'll be continuing our conversation on hard tissue and bone grafting. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
More Healthy Smiles with Dr. Norm Ickert from Eckert Dental Implant Centre after this.
Take control of your financial future with sound investing with Byron Stryloff, Senior Investment Advisor and Chartered Financial Planner with over 30 years of experience on the Business Channel on localwebradio.fm.
Shopping for the lowest mortgage rate? Looking to refinance? Catch the Mortgage Newscast with Jared Dreyer on the Business Channel on localwebradio.fm. Buying or selling a home on the Semiahmoo Peninsula? Catch up on local market conditions on This Week in Real Estate with Lance and Connie Marples from Sutton West Coast Realty on localwebradio.fm. To schedule a face-to-face consultation, you can reach Lance and Connie at 604-538-8888. That's 604-538-8888. And visit them online at www.surreywhiterockhomes.com.
It's time now for more Healthy Smiles with Dr. Norm Ickert.
All right, we are back with Dr. Norm Ickert, and we're continuing our discussion on bone grafting and soft tissue grafting and the different techniques that are available to us today, these incredible techniques. All right, so Dr. Ickert, how long does it take to let this grafted bone mature sufficiently to allow, the next step, which would be the placement of the implant?
Right. If we use our own bone, it usually takes about 3 to 4 months for that bone to get dense and hard enough that we can place the implant. And that's the same if we use human bone from a different source. If we use bovine or equine bone, usually we have to wait 6 to 9 months. And the same thing if we use an alloplast, which is synthetic material, there we can wait anywhere from 9 to 12 months. So therein lies the major reason why we choose certain bones is because
right.
it just speeds up the treatment if we use bone, which is a little bit more natural. Oftentimes, we will mix these different types of bones depending on what we're